If you're looking to play Barbarian in Season 1 and you want a leveling guide that can get you from levels 1 to 50 in 3 to 4 hours, this is the build you should be using to get there extremely fast. Now, even though I'm on my level 100 Barbarian on the Eternal Realm, I have done a ton of playing and testing with the Barbarian, and I have what I think is the best leveling build period for the Barbarian. It allows you to run through the beginning of the game pretty early and get to level 50 very quickly. That being said, I do have a whirlwind guide in the description below, but this build is a little bit different than that because I think it's a lot faster. And what's great about this build, as you can see from the gameplay, is because in the early game you're dependent a lot on fury cost and the amount of fury that you use for a bunch of your different skills, especially with the cooldown reduction nerfs. That's going to make Hoda and Whirlwind very unplayable and hard to level up with early game. Hopefully they'll fix that later. But right now this is the go-to build for leveling the Barbarian. First I'll go over the skills and then I'll go over everything else for you guys so you guys know exactly how to get from level 1 to 50 with your Barb super quick. So we're going to start off with Flay. Flay is going to give us some solid fury generation right off the bat. And also we inflict a lot of bleeding damage over 5 seconds. That's going to give us a bunch of overall damage from levels 1 to 50. That's going to be very important. And the modifiers here for Enhanced Flay and Combat Flay are what we're going to take. And this makes it so that Flay has a 15% chance to make enemies vulnerable, which is super important early game. And with a two-handed sword, which we're going to be using, it means Flay has a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable, giving us vulnerable damage. And then when Flay deals direct damage to an enemy, you get 3% damage reduction and thorns, and that can stack, so that gives you a bunch of survivability just for using Flay, as well as the great fury regeneration. Now before I get into the skills, there is a build link in the description and comment section below, so pull that up and reference that with me because it's going to be very valuable to easily skill up your character and has everything else included. Next, we're going to go down to our core skills. Here we're going to use Rend. Rend is our primary damage dealing and bleeding ability. It is going to deal a bunch of damage, especially bleeding damage to enemies as we fight them, allowing us to basically bleed them out, run away, and let them die, and make it so we can run through the game fairly fast for levels 1 to 50. Now, with the modifiers for Enhanced Rend and Furious Rend, that's going to make it so that dealing direct damage with Rend extends the duration of Vulnerable, meaning we're going to apply Vulnerable here with Flay, and then we're going to extend it here with Rend, keeping enemies vulnerable most all of the time. The other modifier is Direct Damage with Rend grants 4 Fury per enemy hit up to maximum of 20, allows us to generate an insane amount of Fury, so much in big groups that sometimes you won't ever run out and you can just cast Rend infinitely, even at the beginning of the game. This is one of the only builds that you can maintain Fury very effectively. Next, we're going to jump down here to defensive skills. So for defensive skills, we're going to go Rallying Cry just for the shouts, so that way we get the movement speed resource regeneration, and that's going to grant you Unstoppable, removing crowd control effects, and it helps us generate an additional 20 Fury and gives us that additional 20% resource generation as well. Now early in the game you can put 5 out of 5 points here so that way you don't run out of Fury, but ideally most of the time you won't run out, so you really only need the 1 point here. Feel free though, if you're finding you're having Fury generation problems, to swap something out, that way you can max this out 5 out of 5. And again, for those modifiers, we're taking Enhanced Rallying Cry and Tactical Rallying Cry. Then we're going to jump down straight to the brawling skills. We're going to take War Cry. That gives us that extra damage, berserking for 4 seconds, and extra damage bonus if we cast it with 6 enemies around us. That's going to take Enhanced War Cry and Power War Cry. And then we're going to go for Booming Voice 3 out of 3 to increase our shout skill effect duration. And Raid Leader, this is also going to give us healing on top of our build, so we're going to be healing while we're using our shouts consistently. And then we're going to want to take Swiftness. Normally you wouldn't want to take this in a damage build, but this is a leveling build, so we want to be moving as fast as we can. Additionally, you want movement speed on any piece you can get it on, so you can run around the map that much faster. Also, we're going to want 3 out of 3 in Aggressive Resistance. This is going to give us 9% damage reduction while berserking. And then we're going to be using Prolific Fury. So while berserking, Fury generation is increased by that 18%, giving us even more Fury gen to hopefully never run out. And then we're going to go into Weapon Mastery skills. And here you can take 3 out of 3 for Pit Fighter. This is going to give us 9% increased damage to close enemies and 6% distant damage reduction. And then Slaying Strike, so you deal 23% increased damage against injured enemies. And then No Mercy, where you have 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. And this is important because always enemies are going to be slowed. We're going to take 1 point in Hamstring here. That makes our bleeding effect slow healthy enemies, and so most of the time when enemies are always healthy, they'll be slowed and they'll get that 9% increased critical strike chance against them. And then 3 out of 3 for Cut to the Bone, where your bleeding effects deal 15% increased damage to those vulnerable enemies, which you're going to have procced all of the time. Then we're going to take this passive Thick Skin. Each time you take direct damage, gain Fortify. And then we're going to go into Counter Offensive, while you have Fortify for 50% of your max life. you deal 12% increased damage. Now here you really have two different options. It's just depending on what your playstyle is. I would recommend using Steel Grasp. Steel Grasp throws out chains, basically making enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds, making them take a lot more damage than they normally would. And you can also stack up these chains and the amount of charges that they get pretty highly. And here we also get Enhanced Steel Grip to make them vulnerable, like I mentioned, and Fighter Steel Grip. I like this better than the Warrior Steel Grip, even though you get an additional charge here. Here, if it damages an enemy, you get Berserking for 2 seconds. Between these two for vulnerable and getting Berserking, you get an insane amount of increased damage this way. But also feel free if you want to run Death Blow instead. It's a harder hitting skill initially, and you can use it on bosses to deal a lot of damage at 150% increased damage. And you can also gain Berserking from it here with Warrior's Death Blow. So either do this route for Steel Grasp or this Death Blow route down here. Whichever one you feel like this is going to be the higher hitting damage skill. Next, we're going to jump down to our ultimate skills. So for our ultimate skills, the only one you want until level 50 is Call of the Ancients. This is going to give us a huge damage ability with a bunch of different modifiers you can see below. We're going to want to take all 3 of these. You're going to be able to cast this every single 45 seconds or so. And this is going to make it so that you're dealing a ton of damage to all of the targets around you, especially bosses. This can single-handedly save you boss fights and time, so make sure you're running this because it's our biggest damage ability. And then 3 out of 3 for heavy-handed. While using two-handed weapons, you deal 15% increased critical strike damage. And we're going to be using the two-handed sword for the extra bleed damage, so this is going to come in very handy. And then finally, we're going to take a point here in Gushing Wounds. And this, when causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 100% of your critical strike damage bonus. And when overpowered, a bleeding enemy creates an explosion that inflicts a bunch of bleeding damage over 5 seconds. And with our fortified life, we're going to be doing even more additional damage here. So this is the key passive that you want. I'm going to go through the skill tree really quickly just for you to see, but the guide below does have all 58 points in order of leveling. So in case you're missing some skill points from renown or leveling or whatever, I have the exact order leveling wise you should have them in on that guide. And next for actual skills, for Flay, we're going to be running our dual one-handed swords because they have much quicker attack time. I personally like to use those. You can use your two-handed sword here if you want, but I like using the dual wields because you also get additional attack speed from using them from the actual expertise here. So I would recommend doing that with Flay, and then with Rend, I would recommend using obviously your two-handed sword. So that way, for all of that bleeding damage, you get the two-handed sword expertise here. For 20% of direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleed damage over 5 seconds, and you get an additional 30% increased bleed damage for 5 seconds after killing an enemy. So again, if you're not familiar with how the Barbarian technique slot works, whatever weapon you're currently using on a skill, let's say we're using Rend, it has, in this case, our two-handed sword being the ability we're using for it. That means while using this ability, we get the full effects of whatever weapon it is. So since we're using our two-handed sword, we get the two-handed sword expertise here automatically when using this weapon. Now, as an additional bonus, you get the two-handed axe expertise or whatever expertise you select on this expertise menu and put in your technique slot. So essentially, since you get all of the bonuses for the two-handed sword, you don't want to pick the two-handed sword here because you can't get the same bonuses and stack them. The game doesn't let you. So you want to pick an additional one so that way when you're using Rend, you get the bonuses for your two-handed sword and whatever you put in your technique slot. In this case, we're going to go with the two-handed axe expertise, which gives us 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and that is the actual bonus that we get, as you can see here, giving us a lot more damage for vulnerable since we're proccing it very, very often. And then for our gear, I'm going to throw up the aspects you want and just some ideal stats here. So some ideal main stats on your weapons, you want strength, vulnerable damage, crit damage, and all stats will be pretty good early on. Now some of the big things, again, you want as many of these aspects as you can get on your pieces of gear. 4 of the main ones being the aspect of disobedience. This is going to give us additional armor. In early game, this isn't as important, but early game, if you get this, it allows you to run higher level content, get more experience, and basically level up much, much quicker. So if you get that, I would recommend putting that on a piece of gear. Again, for the Barbarian, if you can get the Bold Chieftain's Aspect Ring or the Echoing Fury Ring, the Echoing Fury aspect is going to make it so that your shout skills generate 2 to 4 Fury per second while active. This is going to give you additional Fury generation. And then for your other ring, again, that Bold Chieftain's Aspect Ring is going to decrease your cooldowns by a certain amount of times per enemies nearby when you cast a shout. And this is even more important now that they've nerfed cooldown reduction. Another thing you want is the Edge Master's aspect that is on this one-handed sword, but you're going to want to put it on your two-handed weapon. And what that's going to allow us to do is deal extra % damage based on your primary resource, meaning your Fury. So the higher Fury we have, which we should have a lot of because we have a lot of Fury generation with this build, and it's pretty cheap on Fury cost, meaning we're going to deal that additional percent as damage on the enemy, and that's going to overall make us run through the content that much quicker. And then finally, you want this aspect that's going to give us on lucky hit a 40 to 60% chance to restore 20 Fury when dealing direct damage to an enemy while using Rend. So this is going to give us a decent amount of Fury regeneration on lucky hit, basically almost never having us run out of Fury, which beginning game is going to keep us going and helping us to level up that much more quickly. And the DPS rotation very quickly is going to be using Rallying Cry here to generate maximum Fury, and then get additional movement speed, etc., and resource generation, and then War Cry for extra damage, and it's going to grant us Berserking, giving us increased damage on top of that. And then what you can do is start hitting enemies with Flay. Once you hit enemies enough time with Flay, they should become vulnerable, and then you can use Steel Grasp when needed to make enemies vulnerable and grant you more Berserking, and to pull enemies in close to you, or if you have Death Blow here, you can use Death Blow as needed, and then start hitting them all with Rend, dealing a ton of damage, making them vulnerable again, extending that vulnerable buff, and then getting us extra Fury generation back again by dealing direct damage with this skill. So then you're going to basically rend them to death, and if you're fighting a boss or an even harder fight, you can then use Call of the Ancients to basically wipe the entire battlefield in one go. That being said, that is the fastest way from levels 1 to 50, and this is the best Barbarian leveling build even after the nerfs for Season 1. This build is still very completely viable for leveling up your Barbarian. That being said, if this helped you, make sure to check that build link in the description and the pinned comment, and like the video if this helped you out, and make sure to subscribe down below as well. That being said, check out this video on the left or the right for more awesome Diablo 4 content.